In 2005, in the jungles of the Philippine island of Mindanao, two Japanese men were discovered who had no idea World War II had ended. For 60 years, they had hidden in the jungle, avoiding civilization out of fear of punishment for desertion. When they were found, one soldier was 87 years old, and the other was 83. Surprisingly, even after everything was explained to them and journalists arrived to cover their story, they still feared returning to Japan and facing trial, not realizing how much the world had changed in the past half-century. Lieutenant Yoshio Yamakawa and Corporal Suzuki Nakauchi served in the 30th Infantry Division of the Imperial Army, which landed on the Philippine island of Mindanao in 1944. Their division suffered heavy losses from intense American bombing and was ordered to switch to guerrilla warfare in the jungle. While the remaining troops were later evacuated to Japan, the evacuation order came so suddenly that not all soldiers made it to the assembly point in time. These men unknowingly became deserters, stranded on the Philippine Islands for decades. There were many such cases. Amazingly, even in the 21st century, Japanese soldiers from World War II were still being found in the jungles. To this day, no one knows how many lone Japanese soldiers wandered these forests, surviving on wild food for decades. The first of these remarkable stories came to light in 1961, when two soldiers, Ito Masashi and Hiroki Minakawa, emerged from the forest and surrendered, 16 years after the war's end. They had been hiding on the island of Guam, which is now U.S. territory. They survived the war by pure chance. They had fallen slightly behind their unit and missed an Australian ambush that destroyed the rest of their column. They fled deep into the forest to survive. Guam covers an area of 209 square miles, or over 133,000 acres. Sometimes scattered groups of survivors would meet on the island, but none knew that World War II had ended long ago, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been hit by atomic bombs, that the emperor had surrendered, or that Japan was under American occupation. They survived by eating whatever they could find in the jungle: berries, mushrooms, edible roots, and animals caught in traps. They even resorted to eating mice, grubs, and snakes. They got salt by boiling seawater and occasionally raided local farms. For years, local police and military tried to catch these Japanese soldiers, but all attempts failed because they were experts at hiding in dugouts and communicated only in whispers and hand signals. Eventually, the police gave up the search. Masashi and Minakawa got lucky when they stumbled upon an American dump. It had everything they needed: food, makeshift utensils made from tin cans, clothes, building materials, and other useful items. In 1961, Minakawa, who had been out hunting, mysteriously disappeared. After waiting a day, Masashi went looking for him the next morning and ran into American soldiers. He rushed back to his hideout, but as he approached, he saw U.S. soldiers and a clean-shaven, content Minakawa waiting for him. It turned out that while hunting, Minakawa had encountered local residents who convinced him to surrender. After a brief conversation between the two partisans, during which it became clear that the war had long ended, Masashi followed his friend's example. This marked the end of the Guam saga for the two Japanese soldiers. However, several other Japanese soldiers remained on the large island. One of them was Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi of the Imperial Japanese Army's Marine Corps. Unlike his comrades, Shoichi was no longer just a stranded soldier but had become a deserter. Unable to endure the intense bombardment during the battle for Guam, he panicked and fled his regiment's position, retreating into the island's interior. Unlike his fellow soldiers, Shoichi chose to play it safe and remained hidden in a dugout deep in the jungle. He survived by foraging, eating rats, frogs, and snakes. He occasionally hunted as well. His solitude finally ended in 1972 when local hunters spotted him trying to catch game. They captured him and turned him over to the authorities. When told that his 27-year isolation had been pointless, he collapsed and wept. Upon learning he would soon fly home to Japan on a jet airplane, Yokoi asked in bewilderment, "What's a jet airplane?" Of all these stories, the most famous belongs to Second Lieutenant Hiru Onoda. In December 1944, Onoda was deployed to the Philippines to lead a special unit conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines. In January 1945, he was promoted to second lieutenant and sent to the Philippine island of Lubang. Upon arrival, Onoda urged the Japanese command to prepare for a long-term defense, but his advice went unheeded. As a result, U.S. forces easily defeated the Japanese, forcing Onoda and his unit to retreat deep into the jungle. There, he established a base and began guerrilla warfare with his three subordinates, Akatsu, Kozuka, and Shimada. On September 2, 1945, Japan signed its surrender. By year's end, a plane flew over Onoda's mountain hideout, dropping leaflets that announced Japan's surrender and ordered all Japanese forces to lay down their arms. However, Onoda dismissed these as enemy propaganda, having been trained at the academy to be wary of military disinformation. On January 1st, 1946, Onoda and his 3 companions bowed to the rising sun and vowed to fight until victory. In spring, the island was again showered with leaflets announcing the end of the war. The Japanese even sent former soldiers to the island to walk through the jungle and call out in Japanese, urging their comrades to come out and surrender. Onoda and his companions heard these calls but couldn't believe the war had truly ended. They thought it was just the enemy forcing prisoners into such deceptions. Whenever they heard searchers' voices, they simply moved to a new location. As years passed, the 4 soldiers gradually established a routine. Since staying in one place was dangerous, they constantly moved around the island. During their first year, they only had a small camping tent for shelter, but even that wasn't enough during the rainy season, which lasted from July to October on Lubang. They would get soaked to the bone, their skin turning pale and wrinkled, and sometimes the cold was almost unbearable. Each man had a rifle, 2 hand grenades, and a pistol. They also had nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition and a 6-month supply of rice. They rationed their food as much as possible. Sometimes they were so weak they could only move from place to place through sheer willpower. They feared the Filipinos, knowing they had allied with the US. Whenever they spotted locals, they would hide. If the locals saw them, they would fire warning shots to scare them away, then quickly relocate their camp, knowing the Filipinos would report their presence. Over time, they developed a network of semi-permanent campsites, staying at each for 3 to 5 days. It took 1 to 2 months to complete a full circuit of these locations. Their length of stay depended on how much food they could find from nearby farms. If the situation seemed safe and they could take food without being noticed by the Filipinos, they might stay for up to a week. While Lubang had plenty of wild boars, chickens, and iguanas, Onoda's group mainly relied on cattle raised by local farmers. They would typically steal and kill a cow once or twice a year during the rainy season. This helped solve their food shortage problems. They dried and smoked the meat, getting about 250 slices from one cow, which would last almost 6 months. Their main food source, however, was bananas. They would cut down bunches and slice the bananas, peel and all, into rings, about 3/8 of an inch thick, then wash them thoroughly in water. This process removed most of the bitterness from the green fruit. They would then cook the bananas and dried meat in coconut milk. The finished product resembled overcooked sweet potatoes. It wasn't particularly tasty, but it was their primary food. Occasionally, Onoda and his men would encounter other Japanese guerrillas in the jungle who, like them, didn't know the war had ended years ago. However, they couldn't stay together, so shortly after these encounters, they would go their separate ways. Although Onoda and his 3 subordinates had plenty of food, he strictly rationed their meals. Onoda believed that unlimited access to food would make the soldiers grow soft, lose their discipline and fighting spirit, and become unable to continue their mission. They needed to stay sharp because they regularly attacked military facilities on the island. During their 30-year stay in the jungle, they conducted more than 100 raids on the American radar station, Filipino officials, and police. These attacks forced American and Filipino special forces to repeatedly search the jungle. They occasionally found Onoda's temporary camps, but he always managed to escape. He had learned to read the warning calls of forest birds, which alerted him to intruders in the jungle. At one point, American forces announced they had completely cleared the island to wrap up their operation quickly. The Japanese government, believing Onoda and his men had been killed, declared them dead and awarded them posthumous honors. In reality, Onoda's group was alive and well. In 1950, tragedy struck when Akatsu, the youngest soldier, deserted and surrendered to Filipino police, confirming that the war had indeed ended years ago. Onoda knew the deserter would lead enemies to their location, which is exactly what happened. Once in civilization, Akatsu immediately wrote letters to his former comrades in the jungle, which were dropped by aircraft. When the Japanese government learned that soldiers unaware of the war's end were still hiding in the jungle, they launched a rescue operation. They formed a special commission and sent teams to the Philippines to find the remaining holdouts. Aircraft flew over the island broadcasting messages in Japanese through loudspeakers, urging the soldiers to come out and stop their unnecessary resistance. But Hiru remained skeptical of these messages. Instead, he became even more cautious, worried that the enemy might use gas against his team. For years afterward, they carried towels tied to water flasks. If gas was used, they planned to wet the towels and cover their faces. In 1954, a Philippine police unit encountered Onoda's group. A firefight broke out, and Onoda's friend, Corporal Shochi Shimada, was killed while covering the group's retreat. After this incident, the Philippine government allowed Japan to conduct a search operation on the island. They again used planes with loudspeakers, dropped leaflets and newspapers, and brought relatives of the missing soldiers to the island. However, nothing nothing could convince Onoda anymore. He saw every new search operation as an American trick and became increasingly convinced that the war was still going on. In 1959, Japan once again declared the guerrilla fighter and his comrade dead and awarded him the Order of the Rising Sun, 6th class. For the next 12 years, Onoda and his last surviving companion survived as best they could, constantly preparing for the inevitable landing of Japanese forces. They believed they could help capture the island since they knew all its secret paths. This continued until September 1972, when Philippine police shot Onoda's friend during one of their skirmishes. The lieutenant had now lost his last comrade in arms, with whom he had roamed the island for 27 years. Onoda was completely alone. Loneliness and grief over his lost friends gradually began to wear him down, and another year and a half passed this way. Nearly 30 years after World War II ended, a young Japanese traveler and student named Norio Suzuki decided he would find Onoda at any cost. He flew to the Philippines specifically for this purpose and ventured into the island's jungles, where he walked around calling out Onoda's name, urging him to come out, and it worked. Onoda heard the young man's voice and approached him. The young man told the guerrilla fighter that the war had ended 30 years ago and that his struggle had been meaningless all this time. Finally, Onoda began to consider that this might be true. However, he told the young man he couldn't leave his post without permission from his commander. Hearing this, Suzuki flew to Japan to find this commander, taking photos of Onoda with him, which caused a sensation in the media. The Japanese government quickly contacted Onoda's former commander, who was then working in a bookstore, and he immediately flew to the Philippine island. Soon after arriving, he found Onoda and ordered him to surrender and return to his homeland. The guerrilla bowed and promptly carried out the order. He delivered his report at the radar station and surrendered to the Philippine troops. High-ranking officials from Japan and the Philippines, along with numerous journalists, attended the surrender ceremony. This is documentary footage of those events. The soldier surrendered his weapon and returned to his homeland. However, the Japan that Onoda had fought for no longer existed. The country had fundamentally changed. Concepts, politics, and people's attitudes toward war and life were different. It had become a developed consumer society. Although Onoda captured nationwide media attention, some Japanese people, particularly scientists and journalists raised under the new political and social system, were cold towards the former officer. While some praised him, others labeled him a criminal. Unable to cope with this reception and the realization that he had wasted 30 years of his life, Onoda left his homeland for Brazil. He wrote a book about his years of isolation, and with the proceeds, he purchased a 3,000-acre ranch with 1,800 head of cattle and later got married. 8 years later, he returned to Japan and became a public figure, organizing summer camps where he taught survival skills to school children. Still, the elderly veteran felt out of place in his homeland. In the mid-1990s, Onoda returned to the island where he had spent 30 years, planning to live out his days there. However, he was forced to leave. The locals could not forgive his guerrilla warfare. He spent his remaining years between Brazil and Japan. Onoda deeply regretted his lost years, as shown in his own words. 30 years. Because of the propaganda embedded in my mind, I threw away 30 years of my life. Years I could have spent with family, getting an education, working. Do I regret it? What do you think? Onoda died in Tokyo in 2014 at age 91. In his final years, he must have wondered about other soldiers like himself who continued to roam the jungles their whole lives, considering that some were discovered even in the 2000s. How many of them died there from disease or old age, never knowing that World War II had long since ended? That's all for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the 2 previous videos.